Hello family, welcome to Jimmy Stories. Please do remember to subscribe, like, leave your thoughts on the comments section, and also share this video. It means the world to us. Thank you as you do so. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Now sit back and relax as we dive into this thrilling story briefly. It was a quiet, chilly night by the old bridge. The moon hung high in the sky, its light reflecting off the rushing river below. The sound of water crashing against the rocks echoed in the stillness, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. On the bridge stood two figures, their voices raised in heated argument. The taller of the two, a wealthy elderly man named Mr. Douglas, looked stern but calm, while the younger man, Kelvin, appeared agitated, pacing back and forth with wild, darting eyes. "You think you can cheat me and get away with it?" Kelvin hissed, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "After everything I've done for you? After everything I've sacrificed?" "Kelvin, listen to yourself," Mr. Douglas said in a firm but measured tone. "I trusted you, but you betrayed me. You stole from me, and now you want to justify it with excuses? This ends tonight. I'm going to the authorities." "No, you're not," Kelvin snapped, his voice louder this time, his eyes narrowing dangerously. He stepped closer to Mr. Douglas, his fists clenched. "If you go to the police, everything I've worked for will be ruined. My life will be over." Mr. Douglas shook his head and sighed deeply, his face filled with disappointment. "Kelvin, you did this to yourself. You made your choices. Now you must face the consequences. It's not too late to come clean, but this madness, has to stop." Kelvin froze, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might listen, but then his expression hardened. He glanced around the empty bridge, his mind racing. The only witnesses to their confrontation were the dark trees lining the riverbank and the relentless current below. "I can't let you ruin me," Kelvin muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "What are you?" Mr. Douglas began, but before he could finish his sentence, Kelvin lunged forward. With a sudden burst of force, he shoved the elderly man toward the edge. "No!" Mr. Douglas cried, his voice echoing into the night as he lost his balance. His hands flailed in the air, desperately trying to grab hold of something, anything, to save himself. But the edge of the bridge offered no mercy. Kelvin stood frozen for a split second, watching in horror as Mr. Douglas's body plunged into the dark, churning river below. There was a loud splash, then silence, broken only by the relentless rush of water. Kelvin's chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. It had to be done, he whispered to himself, trying to convince himself that there had been no other way. No one saw anything. No one knows. He glanced around one last time before hurriedly retreating into the shadows, his footsteps echoing as he disappeared into the night. But Kelvin was wrong. Someone had seen everything. Hidden in the tall grass near the riverbank, 13-year-old Malik crouched low, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He had come to the river that evening with his fishing rod, hoping to catch something to surprise his mother with for dinner. He had been quietly waiting for a fish to bite when he heard voices on the bridge above him. Curious but cautious, Malik had crept closer to get a better look. What he saw shook him to his core. He had watched the argument unfold, his small hands gripping the fishing rod so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When Kelvin pushed Mr. Douglas off the bridge, Malik froze in fear. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but his voice was trapped in his throat. As the man hit the water, Malik dropped his fishing rod and crawled closer to the edge of the riverbank, careful to stay hidden. He could see the body of the elderly man drifting in the fast-moving current, his arms limp and lifeless. Malik's breath came in short gasps as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. "Did I really see that?" he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. Did he kill that man?" His instincts screamed at him to run, to get as far away from the river as possible, but something held him back. He couldn't just leave the man in the water. He had seen him alive moments ago, arguing, standing tall. Now, he was motionless, carried by the merciless river. I have to do something, Malik muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. But what could he do? He was just a boy, a scared, trembling boy hiding in the shadows of a terrible crime. Malik's hand shook as he watched the figure of Kelvin disappear into the distance. The man didn't even glance back. He was certain no one had seen him. But Malik had. And now, the weight of that truth pressed down on Malik's small shoulders. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked back at the river. The elderly man was drifting farther away. Malik swallowed hard, his heart racing. He knew he couldn't save him alone, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. This night, by the bridge, would change everything. Malik crouched at the edge of the riverbank, his heart pounding like a drum. The icy wind brushed against his skin, but he barely noticed it. His eyes were locked on the elderly man drifting farther away in the cold, fast-moving water. Malik's fear was overwhelming, but so was the memory of his late father's voice, echoing in his mind. Always do the right thing, Malik, his father used to say. Even if it scares you, even if it's hard. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite it. Malik clenched his fists, his father's words giving him a surge of determination. He couldn't just stand there and watch. Taking a deep breath, he whispered to himself, "You can do this, Malik. You have to try." Without another thought, he ran down the muddy riverbank, kicking off his worn-out slippers as he went. The water looked cold and unforgiving, but there was no time to hesitate. Malik plunged into the river, the freezing temperature shocking his body and stealing his breath. He gasped, his teeth chattering, but he forced himself to keep moving. The current was stronger than he had expected. It pulled at him, dragging him sideways and threatening to sweep him away. His arms flailed as he fought to stay afloat, water splashing into his face and stinging his eyes. "Don't give up," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky but determined. "You can do this." He spotted Mr. Douglas's body a few feet ahead, bobbing lifelessly in the water. Gritting his teeth, Malik pushed against the current with every ounce of strength he had. His small arms burned, and his legs felt like they might give out, but he refused to stop. Finally, he reached the man. Grabbing hold of Mr. Douglas's arm, Malik tried to pull him closer, but the man's body was heavy and unresponsive. "Come on, sir," Malik panted, his voice trembling with effort. "Don't let me lose you now." The river fought him every step of the way, but Malik refused to give in. He kicked hard, using all his strength to drag Mr. Douglas toward the shore. The seconds felt like hours as he battled against the icy water, his breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time he finally reached the riverbank, his arms felt like they might fall off. With a final push, Malik heaved Mr. Douglas onto the muddy ground and collapsed beside him, his chest heaving. He was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the elderly man lying motionless in front of him. "Please don't be dead," Malik whispered, his voice breaking. He crawled closer, his hands trembling as he touched the man's shoulder. "Sir? Can you hear me? Please wake up." But there was no response. Mr. Douglas's face was pale, his lips blue. Malik's stomach twisted in fear. He didn't know what to do, he was just a kid, and this was something far bigger than anything he'd ever faced before. But then, a memory flashed in his mind, a CPR video he had watched during a school safety class. He remembered the teacher's voice explaining the steps, and though he wasn't sure he could do it right, he knew he had to try. "Okay, Malik," he muttered to himself, wiping his wet hands on his shirt. "You can do this. You just have to try." He knelt beside Mr. Douglas and placed his hands on the man's chest, just like the video had shown. 1, 2, 3, Malik counted aloud as he pressed down firmly, his small hands shaking with each compression. The man's chest rose and fell slightly, but there was no other movement. Malik's heart sank, but he refused to give up. "Come on, sir," he said, his voice desperate. "Don't leave me now. You have to wake up." He continued pressing, his arms aching with the effort. After what felt like an eternity, Malik paused and leaned closer, praying for a sign of life. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, suddenly, Mr. Douglas coughed, a weak, raspy sound that made Malik jump back in surprise. "You're alive!" Malik cried, his face lighting up with relief. He quickly turned the man onto his side, patting his back gently as the man coughed up water. "It's okay, sir. You're safe now. I've got you." Mr. Douglas's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first. He looked at Malik, his face etched with confusion and exhaustion. Who?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "It's okay," Malik said again, his voice trembling with both relief and emotion. "You fell into the river, but I pulled you out. You're going to be okay now." Mr. Douglas gave a faint nod, his eyes closing again as he took shallow breaths. Malik sat back, his body still shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. He had done it. Against all odds, he had saved the man's life. But deep down, Malik knew this was only the beginning. Malik knelt beside Mr. Douglas, his small hands shaking as he held onto the man's cold, damp arm. The older man was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, and his pale face was marked with exhaustion and pain. Malik's mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why had someone tried to kill him? And what was Malik supposed to do now? Mr. Douglas opened his eyes slightly, his gaze unfocused at first. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice so faint that Malik had to lean in closer to hear him. "Yes, sir," Malik replied, trying to sound brave even though fear gripped his chest. "But you need help. You're hurt." Mr. Douglas shook his head weakly. No hospitals, they'll find me." His voice cracked, and he coughed harshly, each breath sounding more labored than the last. Malik grabbed his water bottle, the only thing he had with him, and held it to the man's lips. "Here, drink this," Malik urged. Mr. Douglas sipped a little, then pushed the bottle away. "You don't understand," Mr. Douglas whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Kelvin, he tried to kill me." Malik froze. The name struck a chord. Kelvin. That was the man he had seen on the bridge, the one who had pushed Mr. Douglas into the river. Malik's heart pounded as he whispered, "Kelvin? Who is he? Why would he want to hurt you?" Mr. Douglas closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning the strength to speak. He's my business partner. We built everything together. I trusted him. But, greed changes people." His voice faltered, and he paused to catch his breath. "Kelvin wanted it all, my company, my fortune. When I found out he was stealing from me, I confronted him. I threatened to report him to the authorities. That's when Mr. Douglas gestured weakly toward the river, his meaning clear." Malik's stomach churned as the weight of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a random crime. Kelvin had tried to kill Mr. Douglas to cover up his betrayal, and now Malik was the only one who knew the truth. The realization made his chest tighten. What if Kelvin came looking for him? What if he found out Malik had saved Mr. Douglas? "Sir," Malik said, his voice trembling. What if he finds out you're still alive?" Mr. Douglas opened his eyes again, his gaze locking onto Malik's. Though his face was pale and weak, his expression was serious. "That's why you mustn't tell anyone," he whispered. "Not yet. He'll come after me, after you, if he knows." Malik's mouth went dry. The idea of Kelvin coming after him was terrifying. He thought of his mother, who was waiting for him at home. She had no idea what he was caught up in now. Malik swallowed hard, his hands gripping the wet grass beneath him. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice small. Mr. Douglas reached out and placed a trembling hand on Malik's arm. "You've already done so much," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But I need one more favor. Help me get somewhere safe. Just for tonight. I need time to figure out what to do." Malik hesitated. He was just a boy, what could he possibly do to protect a man like Mr. Douglas from someone as dangerous as Kelvin? But as he looked at the older man, so fragile and vulnerable, Malik remembered his father's words, do the right thing, even when it's hard. Taking a deep breath, Malik nodded. Okay. I'll help you. Mr. Douglas gave a faint smile, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Thank you, he murmured. You're braver than most men I've known. Malik glanced around, his mind racing. The riverbank was dark and secluded, but it wouldn't stay that way forever. Sooner or later, someone might come by, and Kelvin might even return to check if his crime was complete. They couldn't stay here. Can you walk? Malik asked, standing up and offering his arm to Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas tried to sit up, but his face contorted in pain, and he let out a low groan. I don't think so, he admitted, sinking back onto the ground. Malik frowned, his mind working quickly. He spotted a sturdy branch lying nearby, and an idea formed in his head. Grabbing the branch, he broke off the smaller twigs and fashioned a makeshift walking stick. Here, he said, kneeling beside Mr. Douglas again. Try leaning on this. I'll help you. With great effort, Mr. Douglas managed to sit up and wrap an arm around Malik's shoulder. Together, they struggled to their feet, the man leaning heavily on the stick and the boy supporting his weight. Malik's small frame wobbled under the pressure, but he gritted his teeth and held firm. Not far, Mr. Douglas rasped. Just, somewhere hidden. Malik nodded, scanning the area. He remembered an old abandoned shed a short distance from the river, a place where he and his friends used to play hide and seek. It wasn't much, but it would provide some shelter for the night. I know a place, he said. It's not too far. Can you make it? Mr. Douglas nodded weakly. I'll try. The journey was slow and difficult. Each step was a struggle, with Mr. Douglas leaning heavily on Malik and the walking stick. Malik's legs ached, and his shoulders burned from the strain, but he didn't complain. The thought of Kelvin lurking somewhere in the darkness kept him moving. Finally, they reached the shed. It was small and dusty, with broken windows and a creaky door, but it was dry and hidden from view. Malik helped Mr. Douglas inside and eased him onto the floor, using his own jacket as a makeshift pillow. Thank you, Mr. Douglas said, his voice barely audible. You've saved my life twice tonight. Malik sat down beside him, his back against the wall. What are we going to do now? He asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Mr. Douglas closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. We wait, he said. Just until I have enough strength to figure out what's next. He opened his eyes slightly, looking at Malik with a seriousness that sent a chill down the boy's spine. But remember, you can't tell anyone, not yet. Kelvin will stop at nothing to protect his secret. Malik nodded slowly, the weight of the secret pressing heavily on his chest. He thought of Kelvin's cold, calculating expression on the bridge and shuddered. I won't tell, he promised, his voice barely above a whisper. As Mr. Douglas drifted off into a restless sleep, Malik sat in the darkness, his mind racing. He had saved a man's life, but now he was caught in a web of danger and secrets he didn't fully understand. For the first time, he realized just how much courage it would take to keep moving forward. Kelvin stepped into his luxurious living room, the soft glow of the chandelier reflecting off the polished marble floors. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, but a cold smile crept across his lips. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal tumbler. It's done, he murmured to himself, sinking into a plush leather chair. Douglas is gone. Finally. He leaned back, savoring the thought of taking over Mr. Douglas's company and fortune. The plan had gone perfectly, or so he thought. No one had been there to witness what happened on the bridge. He was free, completely free. But the following morning, Kelvin's world began to crack. He was reading the news on his tablet when a headline caught his eye, elderly businessman missing after alleged river accident. Police continue search. Kelvin sat up straighter, his brow furrowing. What do they mean, missing? He muttered. He tapped on the article, scanning the details. The report mentioned that Mr. Douglas's body had not yet been found, and authorities were still investigating. Kelvin's heart began to race. He had assumed the river's strong current would carry the body far away. How could they not have found him? He set the tablet down and paced the room, his mind racing. If they didn't find the body, that means, he stopped mid-step, his breath catching. Someone must have seen. Someone must have helped him. The possibility filled him with dread. Kelvin couldn't afford any loose ends. His entire plan depended on Mr. Douglas being out of the picture for good. He had to find out what happened. Kelvin grabbed his coat and stormed out of the house, his driver barely having time to open the car door. "Take me to the bridge," he barked, sliding into the back seat. His mind churned with thoughts as the car sped through the city streets. Who could have been there that night? How much did they see? When they reached the bridge, Kelvin stepped out and scanned the area. It was a quiet, unremarkable spot, surrounded by dense trees and a narrow path leading to the riverbank. Kelvin began asking questions, stopping anyone who passed by. "Did you see anything unusual here last night?" he asked an elderly man walking his dog. The man shook his head. "No, I wasn't out here. Sorry." Kelvin's frustration grew. He moved farther down the path, spotting a group of young boys playing near the river. They stopped and stared as Kelvin approached, his tall frame and sharp suit cutting an intimidating figure. "You boys were around here last night?" Kelvin asked, his voice deceptively calm. One of the boys, the smallest of the group, nodded nervously. "We were fishing, but we left before it got dark." Kelvin crouched slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto the boy. "Are you sure? You didn't see anyone on the bridge? Or in the water?" The boy shook his head quickly. "No, sir. We didn't see anything." Kelvin's jaw tightened. He could sense they were telling the truth, but it did nothing to ease his growing paranoia. He pulled out a wad of cash from his pocket and held it up. "If you hear anything at all, you come to me. Understand?" The boys nodded quickly, their wide eyes fixed on the money. Kelvin tossed a few bills at them before walking away, his patience wearing thin. He moved to a nearby shop, where he questioned the owner. This time, he got a lead. The shopkeeper hesitated, glancing around nervously before speaking. "I heard someone talking about a boy," he said in a low voice. "Said he was near the bridge last night. Don't know if it's true, but that's what they said." Kelvin's eyes narrowed. "A boy? What boy?" "I don't know his name," the shopkeeper stammered, wiping his hands on his apron. "But I think he lives around here. You might want to check with the kids by the school. They know everyone." Kelvin didn't waste a second. He headed straight for the local school, his frustration simmering into anger. By now, he was sure someone had seen something, and if it was a boy, they would be easy to track down. At the school, Kelvin approached a group of students gathered outside. He plastered a polite smile on his face, but his eyes betrayed his intensity. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm looking for a boy who might have been near the bridge last night. He could be about 13 years old, maybe smaller. Do you know anyone like that?" The students exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a tall boy with a confident demeanor, spoke up. "You mean Malik?" Kelvin's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Malik, you say? And where might I find this Malik?" The boy shrugged. "He lives down by the river. You can't miss his place." Kelvin nodded, his smile vanishing as he turned and walked away. Inside, his blood boiled. Malik. A boy who lived near the river. It made sense. If anyone had seen what happened, it was him. And if Malik had been there, it meant Kelvin's secret wasn't safe. As Kelvin climbed back into his car, he clenched his fists, his mind spinning with thoughts of how to deal with this new threat. "You made a mistake, boy," he muttered under his breath. "And now you're going to pay for it." The car pulled away, heading toward the riverbank. Kelvin was determined to find Malik, and when he did, he would ensure that the boy never spoke a word of what he had seen. Malik sat on the edge of his thin mattress, staring at the cracked wall of his small room. His heart felt heavy, and his mind was a storm of thoughts. He had barely slept since the night at the river. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kelvin's face, cold and menacing, pushing Mr. Douglas off the bridge. From the other room, Malik could hear his mother humming softly as she prepared dinner. She was a hard-working woman who always managed to make something out of nothing. She didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. Malik's fists clenched. He couldn't tell her, not now, not when Kelvin could come after him or, worse, her. "Malik," his mother called, interrupting his thoughts. "Why are you so quiet today? You've been acting strange since yesterday." "I'm fine, Mama," Malik replied, forcing his voice to sound normal. "Just tired from school." His mother appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Her brow furrowed as she looked at him. "Are you sure? You've been quiet all week. Is someone troubling you at school?" "No, Mama. I'm fine," Malik said quickly, looking away. He hated lying to her, but he knew it was the only way to keep her safe. His mother sighed, shaking her head. "If there's something you need to tell me, you know you can, right?" "Yes, Mama," Malik murmured, avoiding her gaze. As soon as she returned to the kitchen, Malik let out a shaky breath. His chest felt tight. Every moment he kept the secret, it weighed on him more. He thought about going to the police, but what if they didn't believe him? Worse, what if Kelvin found out and came after them? Malik shook his head. He couldn't risk it. Later that night, when the house was quiet and his mother had gone to bed, Malik slipped out. He carried a small bag filled with bread, water, and some painkillers he had taken from the medicine cabinet. The streets were dark and silent, the air cool against his face as he made his way to the abandoned shed by the river. When he arrived, he pushed open the creaky door. Inside, Mr. Douglas was lying on a pile of old blankets Malik had found the previous night. The elderly man looked better than he had the night before, but still pale and weak. "You came," Mr. Douglas said, his voice low but grateful. "I wasn't sure you would." Malik set the bag down and knelt beside him. "I brought some food and water. And these." He held up the painkillers. "I don't know if they'll help, but my mom uses them when she's not feeling well." Mr. Douglas nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has, Malik." "Thank you." Malik handed him a piece of bread and watched as the man ate slowly, his hands trembling slightly. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor, feeling a strange mix of pride and fear. He had saved this man's life, but at what cost? "Sir," Malik began hesitantly, "Kelvin, he's going to come looking for you, isn't he?" Mr. Douglas paused, his expression darkening. "Yes," he admitted, his voice heavy. "He won't stop until he's sure I'm gone for good. He's ruthless, Malik. But you mustn't worry about that. I won't let him harm you." Malik frowned, his brows knitting together. "But how? You're hurt, and he's dangerous." Mr. Douglas reached out and placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Because of you, I'm alive. That gives me a chance to set things right. I promise, when the time is right, I'll make sure Kelvin pays for what he's done. And I'll make sure everyone knows how brave you are." Malik looked down, unsure how to respond. He was just a boy, yet he had somehow gotten himself involved in something far bigger than he could handle. Still, he couldn't back out now. Mr. Douglas needed him. "Okay," Malik said softly. "But you have to promise to stay hidden. If Kelvin finds out you're alive." "I'll stay here," Mr. Douglas said, his voice firm despite his weakened state. "I'll stay out of sight until I'm strong enough to do what needs to be done." Over the next few nights, Malik continued to sneak out, bringing supplies to Mr. Douglas and keeping him company. They talked in hushed voices, sharing bits of their lives. Malik told Mr. Douglas about his late father and how much he missed him. Mr. Douglas shared stories of his younger days, running his business and dreaming of building something meaningful. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," Mr. Douglas said one night, his voice warm. "Determined, brave, and willing to do what's right." Malik blushed at the compliment but shook his head. "I'm just trying to help. Anyone would do the same." "No, Malik," Mr. Douglas said, his gaze serious. "Not everyone would risk their safety for someone else. What you've done, it's extraordinary." Malik didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and nervousness. As the nights passed, their bond grew stronger. But deep down, Malik knew their time in the shadows wouldn't last forever. Kelvin was out there, searching, and it was only a matter of time before he got closer to the truth. Malik was walking home from school, clutching his worn backpack tightly against his chest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty street. He usually enjoyed this time of day, the quiet walk helping him clear his thoughts, but today felt different. His stomach churned with unease, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. He didn't know why, but he felt like someone was watching him. As he turned the corner near a small row of shops, a black car pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man with sharp features and an unsettling smile. Malik froze when he recognized him. It was Kelvin, the man from the bridge. The man who had pushed Mr. Douglas into the river. "Hey there, kid," Kelvin said, his voice smooth but cold. "You're Malik, right?" Malik's heart raced, but he kept his face blank. "Who's asking?" he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Kelvin chuckled and stepped out of the car. He towered over Malik, his expensive suit spotless, his polished shoes gleaming. "Relax," he said, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm a friend of Mr. Douglas. I've been looking for him." "Have you seen him lately?" Malik's mind raced. Kelvin's friendly tone didn't match the cruel look in his eyes. Malik had no doubt this man was dangerous, and now he was standing just a few feet away. Malik shook his head. "No, I haven't seen him," he said quickly. "I don't know who you're talking about." Kelvin's smile tightened. He took a step closer, forcing Malik to take a step back. "Come on, kid," he said, his voice lower now. "I know you were at the bridge that night. People saw you. If you know something, you should tell me. I just want to help Mr. Douglas." Malik clenched his fists, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear Kelvin's words. He could feel the man's eyes boring into him, searching for any sign of weakness. "I already told you," Malik said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know anything." The smile vanished from Kelvin's face, replaced by a cold, menacing expression. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Listen to me, boy. I'm not someone you want to mess with. If you know something and you're keeping it from me, you'll regret it. Do you understand?" Malik's legs felt like jelly, but he stood his ground. He looked Kelvin in the eye and said, "I don't know anything." Kelvin straightened up, his lips curling into a sneer. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "But if I find out you've been lying to me, you and your family will wish you hadn't." He turned and walked back to his car, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. Before getting in, he glanced back at Malik and added, "This is your only warning." The car sped off, leaving Malik standing there, shaking from head to toe. He felt like he couldn't breathe. Kelvin's words echoed in his mind, "You and your family will wish you hadn't." Malik thought of his mother at home, completely unaware of the danger they were in. He couldn't let Kelvin hurt her. Malik took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew he couldn't keep this secret any longer. Kelvin was too dangerous, and the situation was getting worse. There was only one thing left to do. He ran. His legs moved as fast as they could, carrying him down the street toward the nearest police station. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his chest ached, but he didn't stop. He burst through the station doors, gasping for air. A police officer at the front desk looked up in surprise. "What's wrong, son?" the officer asked, standing up. "I need to talk to someone," Malik said, his voice trembling. "It's about Mr. Douglas. I know what happened to him." The officer's expression turned serious. "Come with me." He led Malik to a small office, where two other officers joined them. Malik sat in a chair, his hands shaking as he began to speak. "There was a man, Kelvin," Malik said, his voice unsteady. "He pushed Mr. Douglas off the bridge. I saw everything. And I pulled Mr. Douglas out of the river. He's alive, but he's hiding." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. One of them, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, said, "That's a serious accusation, son." "Are you sure about this?" Malik nodded vigorously. "Yes, I'm sure. I saw it happen. Kelvin threatened me. He said he'd hurt my family if I told anyone." The room fell silent as the officers processed Malik's words. Finally, the first officer leaned forward. "Where is Mr. Douglas now?" Malik hesitated. He didn't want to reveal the location of the shed until he was sure the police believed him. "I'll take you to him," he said, "but only if you promise to protect him. And my mom." The officers looked at each other again, then nodded. "All right, kid," the mustached officer said. "We'll look into this. If what you're saying is true, we'll keep you and your mom safe." Malik felt a wave of relief wash over him, but his fear didn't disappear completely. He had taken a big risk coming here, but it was the only way to protect his family and help Mr. Douglas. As he left the station with the officers, he prayed that he had made the right choice. The police were silent as they gathered outside Kelvin's office building, their plan carefully laid out. Malik stood with one officer, his heart racing. It had been days since he'd first come forward with the truth, and now the moment of justice had arrived. Malik glanced nervously at Mr. Douglas, who was standing beside him, looking healthier but still weary. The older man gave him a reassuring nod. "You've been brave, Malik," Mr. Douglas said quietly. "Thanks to you, this ends today." Malik swallowed hard and nodded. He wanted this to be over, not just for himself, but for his mother, for Mr. Douglas, and for everyone Kelvin had wronged. Inside Kelvin's office, the man sat confidently at his large mahogany desk, flipping through documents. He was already thinking about the next steps to take over Mr. Douglas's company. His arrogance blinded him to the growing whispers about his actions. Kelvin leaned back in his chair, smirking. "It's all mine now," he muttered to himself. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. He straightened up, frowning as the door to his office burst open. Two uniformed police officers entered, their expressions stern. "Mr. Kelvin," one officer said firmly, "we need to speak with you." Kelvin's smirk faded instantly. He stood, his tone sharp. "What's the meaning of this? Do you know who I am?" "We know exactly who you are," the second officer replied, stepping closer. "And we have reason to believe you're involved in the attempted murder of Mr. Douglas." Kelvin's face turned pale, but he quickly regained his composure. "That's ridiculous," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Douglas is dead. Everyone knows that." "Is that so?" a new voice called out from the doorway. Kelvin turned, and his jaw dropped. There, standing tall and alive, was Mr. Douglas. His suit was crisp, his presence commanding, and his eyes burned with determination. "Surprised to see me, Kelvin?" he asked coldly. Kelvin stumbled back, his confidence crumbling. How are you alive?" Mr. Douglas stepped into the room, followed by Malik and more officers. "Because of this boy," Mr. Douglas said, gesturing toward Malik. "He saved my life when you tried to end it." Kelvin's eyes darted to Malik, who stared back with quiet defiance. That's a lie. Kelvin shouted, his voice rising in panic. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Douglas ignored him and turned to the officers. This man is a fraud and a murderer. I trusted him as my business partner, and he betrayed me. When I confronted him about the money he stole from our company, he tried to silence me for good. Do you have proof of these accusations? Kelvin snapped, trying to sound composed, though his voice quivered. You can't just walk in here and slander me. One of the officers stepped forward, holding a folder. We have plenty of proof, Kelvin. Mr. Douglas provided records of your financial fraud, bank statements, forged documents, everything. And Malik here is an eyewitness to your attempt on Mr. Douglas's life. Kelvin's face turned red with anger. He's just a kid. He's lying. No, I'm not, Malik said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. I saw you push him off the bridge. I saw everything. And when you came to my school, you threatened me. Kelvin's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His carefully constructed lies were falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room fell silent as the officers moved toward Kelvin. He tried one last desperate attempt to escape. Wait. This is all a misunderstanding, he exclaimed, backing away. I can explain. Save it, one of the officers said, pulling out handcuffs. You've done enough damage. Kelvin struggled as they secured his hands behind his back, his once confident demeanor replaced by desperation. You'll regret this, he shouted, glaring at Mr. Douglas and Malik. You don't know what you're doing. Mr. Douglas stepped closer, his expression cold and unyielding. No, Kelvin. You're the one who didn't know what you were doing. You thought you could get away with it, but you underestimated the courage of a young boy and the power of the truth. As Kelvin was escorted out of the office, the staff outside looked on in shock. Whispers spread like wildfire. The mighty Kelvin, the man who had always seemed untouchable, was being led away in disgrace. Back in the police station, Malik sat beside Mr. Douglas, feeling both relieved and exhausted. The officers had taken Kelvin into custody, and his crimes were now exposed for everyone to see. Malik's heart was still racing, but for the first time in days, he felt safe. You did it, Malik, Mr. Douglas said, his voice filled with gratitude. Because of you, Kelvin is going to pay for what he's done. Malik shook his head. We did it, he said softly. You trusted me, and that gave me the courage to speak up. Mr. Douglas smiled, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. You're a remarkable young man. And I haven't forgotten my promise. From now on, I'll make sure you and your family are taken care of. Malik's eyes widened. You don't have to do that, sir. I just wanted to help. But you did more than help, Mr. Douglas insisted. You risked everything to save me and bring justice. The least I can do is ensure you and your mother never have to struggle again. Malik nodded slowly, gratitude swelling in his chest. He thought of his mother and how this could change their lives for the better. In the weeks that followed, Malik's bravery became the talk of the town. News outlets covered the story of the young boy who had saved a wealthy businessman and brought a dangerous criminal to justice. People praised Malik for his courage and determination, and strangers stopped him in the streets to shake his hand. Mr. Douglas kept his word, supporting Malik and his mother in countless ways. He helped them move to a better home, paid for Malik's schooling, and made sure they had everything they needed. Despite the newfound attention, Malik remained humble, simply grateful that he had been able to do the right thing. As Kelvin's trial approached, Malik felt a sense of closure. The man who had caused so much fear and harm was finally facing the consequences of his actions. And while the journey had been terrifying, it had also shown Malik the power of bravery and standing up for what was right. Malik sat on the porch of their new home one evening, watching the sun set. His mother joined him, placing an arm around his shoulders. You've grown so much, Malik, she said softly. I'm so proud of you. Malik smiled, leaning into her embrace. I just did what I had to, Mama, he replied. That's what Papa would have wanted. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Malik felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced his fears, protected his family, and helped bring a dangerous man to justice. And in the process, he had proven to himself, and the world, that even the smallest voices can make the biggest difference. I hope you enjoyed this thrilling story. Please do well to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, my lovely friends.